Have you ever felt the weight of a single moment? A choice made, a word spoken, a path taken that changed everything that followed? Our lives are a tapestry of these moments, woven together into the story of who we are. But so is our history. It is not a great, solid, unchangeable monolith moving in a straight line, as the old books might have us believe. It is a delicate fabric, a living ecosystem, woven from a billion threads of chance, choice, and consequence. And every so often, one of those threads, if pulled, could have unraveled it all. These are the historical hinges. The quiet, almost missed moments upon which the entire world pivots. A wrong turn down a city street. A ship that fails to catch the wind. A single vote cast one way instead of another. Tonight, we journey to the worlds that were born in those other moments. We will walk the paths that faded into mist. And along the way, we will journey to a world that was saved not by a king or a general, but by a man in a secret bunker who simply disobeyed an order, and in his quiet defiance, prevented the end of the world. The stories we are about to explore are often called alternate histories. But that phrase feels too simple, too much like fiction. Let us think of them instead as the echoes of time. The faint, ghostly sounds of the worlds that could have been, still vibrating just beyond the edge of our own. This is not an exercise in fantasy. It is a powerful, profound thought experiment. It is a journey that allows us to peel back the layers of the present and see the delicate, improbable architecture of how we came to be. It is a form of meditation on the nature of causality itself. By looking at the worlds that almost were, we can begin to understand the true fragility of our own reality. We see that the existence of our nations, our technologies, our deepest philosophies, was never guaranteed. They are the survivors of 1,000 historical shipwrecks. They are the result of a chain of events so unlikely, so specific, that their existence is nothing short of a miracle. To question the past is not to diminish it, it is to appreciate it more deeply. To understand that the world we inhabit is just one story, in a library of infinite, unwritten possibilities. It teaches us that history is not just a story of great forces, of economics and empires, but also a story of individuals, of accidents, of weather patterns, of single moments of human error or human courage. Our journey tonight will be a long one, a deep dive into this library of echoes. We will explore 20 of the most significant and surprising of these turning points. To give our travels shape, we have arranged them into 4 chapters, 4 great acts in the story of what might have been. We will begin in the ancient world, among the marble columns and papyrus scrolls, where the very foundations of Western thought could have been built on different ground, where a single life spared or a single library saved could have sent humanity down a completely different technological and philosophical path. Then, we will sail into the age of discovery, reimagining a world where the maps were drawn by different hands, where the great fleets of China, not the caravels of Europe, defined the contours of the globe. From there, we will enter the crucible of modernity, a time of revolution and war where our world was forged in fire, and we will see how easily the flames could have shaped a different world from the ashes. And finally, we will stand on the razor's edge of the 20th century, a time of ideologies and atomic weapons, where the entire human story came breathtakingly close to its final, tragic chapter. But before we step through the veil into our first lost timeline, let's take a brief moment to ground ourselves in our own. The grand what-ifs of history are built from the same material as the small, quiet what-ifs of our own lives. A road not traveled, a conversation not had, a chance not taken. We all have them. They are the gentle ghosts that walk with us, not as regrets, but as reminders of the infinite possibilities that sleep within every moment. They are the stories of the other selves we might have become. So, I invite you to share one. What is one what-if from your own life that you sometimes ponder? You need not share the details, just the shape of the question. It is a beautiful way to see the shared humanity in this grand idea, to connect our small, personal stories to the great, sweeping story of us all. Let me know in the comments below. Now, with our minds open and our hearts quiet, let the journey begin. What if Alexander the Great lived to old age? The year is 323 BC. The known world lies at the feet of one man, Alexander of Macedon. In just over a decade, he has accomplished the impossible. He shattered the mighty Persian Empire, the superpower of its age, and marched his armies from the shores of Greece to the dusty plains of India. His empire is a sprawling, multicultural tapestry, the largest the Western world had ever seen, stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Hyphasis River. But it was more than just a conquest, it was a vision. Alexander was not merely a warrior, he was a student of Aristotle, a man who dreamed of fusing the cultures of East and West, creating a concept he called homonoia, a union of hearts and minds. He founded over 20 cities, all named Alexandria, from Egypt to the edges of Afghanistan, seeding them with Greek colonists. He encouraged trade, fostered a new, Hellenistic identity that blended Greek philosophy with the ancient wisdom of Egypt and Persia, and even held a mass wedding for his officers and Persian noblewomen. He stood on the precipice of creating a new kind of world. But he was just 32 years old, and his work, in his mind, had only just begun. The hinge upon which this world turned was not a battlefield, but a sickbed. After a prolonged banquet and drinking bout in the sweltering heat of Babylon, Alexander fell ill with a sudden, violent fever. For 2 agonizing weeks, the world held its breath as the conqueror's strength failed him. Was it poison slipped into his wine by a jealous rival? Typhoid from the marshy waters of the Euphrates? Or perhaps malaria, a constant threat in the region? History offers no certain answer. We only know that his body, which had endured countless wounds and the hardships of a decade-long campaign, could not fight this invisible enemy. His generals, the powerful men who had carved up the world with him, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, gathered around his bed, asking to whom he would leave his vast empire. He whispered his final, fateful words. To the strongest. On a June evening, as the Mesopotamian sun set on his vast, new world, Alexander the Great died. His vision died with him. His empire, lacking a clear heir or a designated successor, was immediately torn apart by his ambitious generals in the bloody wars of the Diadochi, plunging the world into 40 years of savage warfare. The dream of unity was shattered. But let us imagine a different world. Imagine the fever breaks. After weeks of rest, Alexander rises from his bed, weakened, humbled, and with a newfound sense of his own mortality. He understands now that his empire cannot be held together by conquest alone. It must be bound by something stronger. He spends the next 40 years of his life not just fighting, but building. The planned Arabian campaign goes ahead, but it is his last great conquest. He secures the trade routes, then turns his focus inward. He establishes a clear line of succession, naming his son Alexander IV as his heir and creating a council of regents drawn from both Macedonian and Persian nobility to guide him, ensuring a stable transition. He makes Alexandria in Egypt his true imperial capital, a global center for trade, culture, and learning, but he also elevates Babylon and founds a new capital in India, creating a tripod of power upon which his empire rests. He leads expeditions back to the east, not with soldiers, but with philosophers, scientists, and engineers. A great dialogue begins. Greek logicians debate with Buddhist monks in the newly founded universities of the Indus Valley. The mathematics of Pythagoras engages with the Indian concept of zero, leading to an explosion in mathematical and astronomical theory. The art of the era becomes a breathtaking fusion, sculptures of a Greek-looking Buddha, temples built with Corinthian columns and Persian designs. This Greco-Indian culture becomes the vibrant heart of the empire. Meanwhile, in the West, the rising Roman Republic remains a contained, regional power. It expands through Italy, but finds its path to the east blocked by the stable, wealthy, and overwhelmingly powerful Hellenistic Empire. Carthage is not Rome's great rival, but a key trading partner in Alexander's globalized economy. The Punic Wars never happen. Instead of endless conflict, the Mediterranean knows a century of peace under the Pax Alexandrina. Alexander, in his old age, becomes not Alexander the Great, the conqueror, but Alexander the Wise, the architect of a truly global civilization. He commissions great infrastructure projects. A canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea is completed, and a road network rivaling the Persian Royal Road connects his major cities. He establishes a universal currency and a standardized system of laws based on a blend of Greek and Persian principles. The empire is not a homogeneous Greek state, but a true multicultural federation, where a merchant from Athens can converse with a scholar from Taxila in a shared language of commerce and ideas. He dies peacefully in his palace in Alexandria at the age of 72, leaving behind not a fragile conquest, but a stable, enduring civilization that has fundamentally changed the course of human history. In this alternate world, the rise of Rome is permanently thwarted. The dominant language of culture, philosophy, and power is not Latin but Greek. The political and philosophical landscape of the West is utterly transformed. This unified Hellenistic empire, stretching from Italy to India, would have created a vastly different crucible for the ideas and religions that would later emerge. Our world, so deeply shaped by the laws, language, and legacy of Rome, would be an unrecognizable phantom, an echo of a history that never was, a testament to the vision of a single man who lived to see it through. We've just seen an empire born from the vision of one man, and another world born from his absence. A single life, a single fever, and the course of history is diverted forever. It makes one feel small, and yet, it shows the profound power that a single individual can hold, their personal story becoming the story of the world. It reminds us that history is not just a tide of inevitable forces, but a collection of human lives, each with its own potential to change everything. As you're listening to this unfold, I'm curious where in the world you are. Are you in a place that was once part of Alexander's world, a land he marched through, or a land he never knew existed? Let me know in the comments. It's fascinating to imagine our quiet community spread across the globe, all listening to the same echo in the dark, connected by a story that binds us across continents and time zones. What if the Library of Alexandria was never destroyed? Imagine a building that was not just a collection of scrolls, but the living, breathing mind of the ancient world. For centuries, this was the great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. It was the undisputed center of knowledge on earth, a sanctuary for scholars and a repository for the sum of human genius. Founded by the successors of Alexander, it was a state-funded research institute, complete with lecture halls, gardens, and observatories. It was said that any ship docking in Alexandria's port was required to surrender its books to be copied by the library's scribes. At its peak, it held perhaps 500,000 papyrus scrolls, the complete, lost histories of Berossus of Babylon, the golden automaton of Philo, the astronomical charts of Aristarchus, who correctly theorized that the Earth orbited the Sun 1,700 years before Copernicus. It contained blueprints for primitive steam engines designed by Hero of Alexandria, detailed anatomical studies by Herophilus who discovered the nervous system, and the work of Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. It was a beacon of intellectual light, a promise of a future guided by reason and discovery. The death of the library was not a single event, but a slow, painful decay by 1,000 cuts. There was no one moment where it all burned down, despite the popular myth. Its decline began with a series of catastrophic events. A key turning point was in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar, during his civil war in the city, set fire to his own ships. The fire spread, and while it likely didn't destroy the main library itself, it consumed a massive warehouse on the docks containing tens of thousands of scrolls, possibly overflow copies and books awaiting cataloging. This was the first great hemorrhage of knowledge. Later, a series of purges by Roman emperors, who saw the independent-minded scholars as a threat, saw intellectuals expelled. Funding was cut. And finally, in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, rising religious zealotry saw pagan institutions as targets. The Serapeum, a magnificent sister library, was destroyed by a Christian mob in 391 AD. The hinge, then, is not one fire, but a sustained, centuries-long failure of humanity to protect its own collective mind. It was a slow, tragic choice to let the light go out. But imagine a world where that choice was never made. Imagine Caesar's fire as contained to the ships. More importantly, imagine a series of enlightened Roman emperors, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, who see the library not as a pagan relic but as the ultimate treasure of their empire. They declare it a sacred site, protected by imperial decree, and pour funds into its preservation and expansion. The knowledge is not just preserved, it is built upon. Hero of Alexandria's steam engine, the Olipile, is not just a curious novelty, it is studied by the finest Roman engineers. They see its potential. By the 2nd century AD, primitive steam-powered pumps are draining mines in Britain and powering bellows in the forges of Gaul. This sparks an industrial revolution, Roman style. The famous Roman roads are now paralleled by early railways, with steam-powered wagons transporting legions and goods across the empire. Aristarchus's heliocentric model is not a forgotten theory. It is proven by astronomers using improved telescopes, crafted with superior lens-grinding techniques developed in the library's workshops. The scientific revolution begins not in the 16th century, but in the 2nd. The Dark Ages, that long slumber of Western intellect, never happen. Instead, it is an age of illumination. The full, unbroken knowledge of the ancients is passed directly into the hands of a technologically advancing Roman civilization. The medical knowledge of Herophilus is expanded upon, leading to an understanding of sanitation and disease that prevents the great plagues that would later devastate Europe. Complex mathematics, including early forms of calculus preserved from the work of Archimedes, allows for engineering marvels that dwarf the Colosseum. By the time the Western Roman Empire begins to face political instability in the 4th and 5th centuries, its technological and scientific base is so advanced that it doesn't collapse, it evolves. Its superior military technology, powered by early forms of gunpowder whose formulas were preserved from Chinese texts, easily repels barbarian invasions. The empire transforms into a new kind of state, one based on industry and science, with a population that is healthier, better educated, and more prosperous than any civilization in our own timeline until the 19th century. In this world, humanity's progress is accelerated by 1,000 years. We would have been navigating by GPS in the age of sail and exploring the principles of calculus while the great cathedrals of our timeline were still being built. The modern world, with all its technological marvels, would have arrived over a millennium ago. The entire story of humanity would be one of continuous, unbroken scientific advancement, all because we chose to guard our greatest treasure instead of letting it turn to ash, a constant reminder of the immense cost of forgotten knowledge. What if China, not Rome, had conquered the West? In the 2nd century BC, while the Roman Republic was locked in its life-or-death struggle with Carthage, Another great power was consolidating its strength at the far end of the Eurasian landmass, the Han Dynasty of China. It was a sophisticated, powerful, and centralized state, rivaling Rome in its population, military might, and cultural achievements. The Han had developed paper, the crossbow, and a highly organized, meritocratic bureaucracy based on Confucian principles. Their primary concern was the constant threat from the nomadic Xiongnu horsemen to the north, a persistent danger that drained the treasury and threatened the stability of their borders. To find allies and gather intelligence on this enemy, the Emperor Wu sent an envoy named Zhang Qian on an epic journey west in 138 BC. For 13 years, Zhang Qian traveled through Central Asia, reaching as far as modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. He returned not with alliances, but with something far more valuable: knowledge. He brought back tales of sophisticated, urbanized civilizations in the West, the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms that were the remnants of Alexander's empire. And he brought back word of a breed of powerful, magnificent, heavenly horses, in the Fergana Valley, far superior to the smaller horses of China. Upon hearing Zhang Qian's report, Emperor Wu was intrigued. He sent armies west to secure the heavenly horses and to push back the Xiongnu, eventually establishing the network of trade routes we now call the Silk Road. But this was primarily a defensive and commercial venture. The Han were focused on securing their borders, not on distant conquest. The hinge of fate is this: what if the emperor's ambition had been far greater? What if, upon learning of the fractured, warring successor states of Alexander's empire, he saw not just a source of horses, but an opportunity for boundless expansion? What if the report of wealthy, disorganized Western kingdoms, combined with the constant pressure from the nomads, led him to a radical new conclusion, that the only way to secure the celestial empire was to bring the entire world under its harmonious, civilized rule? What if, instead of a limited military expedition, he had committed the full might of the Han dynasty to a multi-generational policy of relentless westward expansion, declaring it the ultimate destiny of his people to bring order to the barbarians of the setting sun? The story of this world is one of a slow, methodical, and unstoppable advance. The Han armies, disciplined, equipped with crossbows, and brilliantly supplied by their bureaucratic state, push west. They are not just conquerors, they are colonizers and administrators. They defeat the Xiongnu and absorb the nomadic tribes into their military machine, creating unstoppable cavalry wings. They roll over the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, not just defeating them but absorbing their Hellenistic science and art, which they document and study with intense curiosity. The Parthian Empire, which in our timeline was a major rival to Rome, now finds itself caught between two advancing powers. But the Han are more patient. They build infrastructure, establish Confucian academies, and synthesize the populations they conquer. A century after Zhang Qian, they stand on the borders of Mesopotamia. Here, they finally meet the outposts of the Roman Republic. But it is not a clash of equals. This Rome is a republic that has not yet been forged into an empire by the vast wealth and manpower gained from the conquest of the East. It is smaller, less wealthy, and now faces a unified, continent-spanning superpower. The conflicts are long and bloody, fought across the deserts of Syria and the hills of Anatolia. The Roman legions are formidable, but they are facing an empire that can draw on the resources of an entire continent. The Han dynasty, with its vast population, advanced logistics, and centralized command, slowly grinds down the Roman war machine. By the 1st century AD, the Mediterranean is not Mare Nostrum, our sea, for the Romans, but a western province of the Han Empire, administered by a governor-general from the capital city of Chang'an. Roman senators are replaced by Mandarin officials who have passed rigorous civil service exams. The Forum in Rome is rebuilt as a grand Confucian temple. In this world, the entire foundation of Western civilization is erased and replaced. The dominant philosophies are not Stoicism and Platonism, but Confucianism and Taoism. The system of governance is not based on Roman law and Greek democracy, but on a sophisticated, meritocratic imperial bureaucracy selected by examination. The dominant language of trade and government across Eurasia is not Latin, but a form of Han Chinese. The religions of Christianity and Islam, if they arise at all, do so in the shadow of a vastly different and more powerful imperial culture, perhaps becoming minor, localized faiths, forever changed by the encounter with Eastern thought. What if the volcanic eruption of Thera didn't destroy Minoan civilization? Long before the Golden Age of Athens, before even the Trojan War, the first great European civilization flourished on the island of Crete. They were the Minoans, a vibrant and sophisticated Bronze Age people who dominated the Aegean Sea around 1600 BC. Theirs was not an empire of conquest, but of commerce. They were a thalassocracy, a sea power, their wealth built on trade that connected Greece, Egypt, and the Near East. Their cities were not surrounded by massive walls. Their security was their fleet. Their culture was unique, filled with elegant art celebrating nature, grand palaces like Knossos with labyrinthine corridors, and religious practices centered on goddesses and the mysterious ritual of bull leaping. They were a people of the sea, of art, and of peace, a stark contrast to the militaristic, patriarchal societies that would follow. They were, in essence, the brilliant, sunlit overture to the story of Western civilization, a culture of profound and peaceful achievement. But their psalm was about to be silenced by a cataclysm of unimaginable scale, a force of nature that would erase their world from history. Just 70 miles north of Crete lay the island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Around 1628 BC, the volcano at its heart erupted in one of the most violent geological events in recorded human history, an explosion hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb at Hiroshima. The immediate effects were devastating, burying the Minoan outpost of Akrotiri under 60 meters of ash. But the secondary effects were the true civilization killers. The collapse of the volcano's caldera triggered a series of colossal tsunamis, some perhaps hundreds of feet high, which slammed into the northern coast of Crete. These waves would have obliterated the Minoan fleets in their harbors and wiped their unfortified coastal cities from the map in an instant. In the years that followed, a volcanic winter settled over the region. A thick veil of ash in the atmosphere would have lowered global temperatures, leading to widespread crop failure, famine, and social collapse. The hinge of fate was not a battle or a political decision, but the furious, indifferent power of the earth itself, which broke the back of the Minoan civilization and left it fatally vulnerable. But imagine a world where Thera remains dormant, a peaceful island in a calm Aegean Sea. The Minoan civilization, untouched by catastrophe, continues its golden age. For the next few centuries, they are the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. Their naval and commercial supremacy is absolute. The rising Mycenaean kingdoms on the Greek mainland remain secondary powers, heavily influenced by Minoan culture, their art, their religion, their writing, but unable to challenge their dominance at sea. The Minoan model of a decentralized, palace-based economy flourishes, creating a network of prosperous, interconnected city-states across the Aegean islands. Their writing system, the still undeciphered Linear A, evolves and spreads, becoming the lingua franca of trade from Sicily to Syria. The cultural implications are profound. The militaristic, heroic age of the Mycenaeans, which gave us the legends of Agamemnon and the Trojan War, never happens in the same way. Greek culture, in its infancy, develops along a different path, one that values art over war, trade over tribute, and diplomacy over conquest. The philosophical and political developments of classical Athens, when they eventually arise, spring from a completely different cultural DNA. What if the first great European power was defined not by the spear, but by the olive branch? The Minoan focus on powerful goddesses and the central role of priestesses in their society could lead to the development of more egalitarian, less patriarchal social structures on the mainland. Their deep trade connections with Egypt and the Near East create an even richer, more cosmopolitan fusion of ideas, technologies, and philosophies. The subsequent history of Europe is built not on the foundation of warring city-states, but on a legacy of peaceful cooperation and maritime commerce. In this world, the legacy of the Minoans is not a myth of a lost Atlantis, but the direct cultural foundation of Europe. The militarism of the Mycenaeans and the subsequent Greek city-states is tempered, perhaps even replaced, by a more peaceful and artistic worldview. The very soul of Western civilization, its art, its politics, its philosophy, would be rooted in the maritime and commercial traditions of Crete. It would be a world where the first and most enduring symbol of European power was not the eagle or the lion, but the peaceful, leaping dolphin of the Knossos frescoes. What if Pontius Pilate pardoned Jesus? The year is approximately 33 AD. The Roman province of Judea is a cauldron of religious and political tension, a land simmering with messianic expectation and resentment against foreign rule. During the volatile festival of Passover, Jerusalem is crowded and on edge. In this charged atmosphere, a charismatic Galilean preacher, Jesus of Nazareth, has been arrested. His teachings on a kingdom of God have attracted a large following among the poor, but have also been interpreted by the temple authorities, the Sadducees, as a threat to their own power and a potential spark for a rebellion. Fearing a riot that would bring the brutal wrath of Rome down upon them, they have brought Jesus before the man tasked with keeping order at all costs, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. For Pilate, this is a political problem. He is a pragmatic, and by all accounts ruthless, administrator, and his primary goal is to prevent an uprising during the most dangerous week of the year. He holds the power of life and death in his hands. The trial, as recounted in the Gospels, is a tense political negotiation. The temple elite demand execution, accusing Jesus of sedition and claiming to be a king, a direct challenge to Caesar. Pilate, however, is portrayed as skeptical, finding no real legal fault in Jesus that warrants the death penalty. He is caught between the pressure of the crowd, expertly manipulated by the priests, and his duty to uphold Roman law. He fears that if he releases Jesus, the priests will send a formal complaint to the notoriously unforgiving Emperor Tiberius, accusing Pilate of being soft on insurrection. The hinge is his final decision. In our timeline, choosing political expediency over his own legal judgment, he famously washes his hands of the matter. He gives in to the crowd's demands and condemns Jesus to crucifixion, a common and brutal Roman punishment designed to make an example of rebels and enemies of the state. The choice is made. The cross is prepared. But imagine, in that moment, Pilate makes a different calculation. Annoyed by the local priest's transparent manipulation and seeing Jesus as just another harmless philosopher, he decides that asserting Roman authority is more important than placating a troublesome faction. He declares Jesus innocent of sedition. Perhaps, as a compromise, he orders him to be flogged for causing a disturbance, and then releases him with a stern warning to leave Jerusalem. Or perhaps he simply exiles him to a remote part of the province. Jesus, no longer a martyr, survives. He continues his ministry for several more decades, becoming a respected, if controversial, teacher, perhaps writing down his own parables and philosophies. His movement continues, but it is fundamentally changed. Without the crucifixion and, crucially, the resurrection, the central, transformative event of Christian theology is absent. The story is no longer about a dying and rising God-man who conquers death and offers salvation. It is about the ethical teachings of a wise, mortal man. Christianity, as we know it, would not exist. The movement of Jesus would likely remain a sect within Judaism, similar to the Essenes or Pharisees, focused on moral reform. It would lack the explosive, universal appeal that the story of sacrifice and resurrection gave it in the diverse, mystery cult-filled Roman world. Saul of Tarsus, the future Apostle Paul, would have no blinding conversion on the road to Damascus, as there would be no resurrected Christ to encounter. Without Paul, the brilliant theologian and missionary who opened the movement to non-Jews and spread it across the Mediterranean, it would almost certainly have remained a localized Judean phenomenon. The Roman Empire would not have a new religion to first persecute and then adopt. The entire religious and political history of the West would be unrecognizable. In this world, the cross is not a symbol of salvation, but simply a forgotten instrument of Roman torture. The history of the West, so profoundly shaped by the Christian faith, would be utterly alien. The moral, philosophical, and political landscape would have evolved from different roots, perhaps a revitalized Roman paganism, the rise of Mithraism, or a more philosophical form of Judaism. The world we know, in which billions identify with the story of a man executed in Judea, would simply never have come to be, all because a Roman governor chose law over politics. The stories of the Minoans and of early Christianity are stories of knowledge, one civilization's entire culture buried under ash, and one religion's foundational story that was never written. History is filled with these lost pieces, these silent gaps on the shelf. What piece of lost knowledge, a book from Alexandria, a forgotten Minoan ritual, a piece of art, a lost philosophy, would you most want to recover from the past? What secret do you wish the silent stones of history would tell you? Share your thoughts below. It's a way of building our own small library of wonders, right here in the comments, a collection of the things we wish we knew. What if the Vikings established a permanent colony in North America? Around the year 1000 AD, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, the Atlantic Ocean was conquered. Norse sailors, the Vikings, using only the sun, stars, and the flight of birds, navigated their open-decked longships from Scandinavia to Iceland, to Greenland, and finally, to the shores of a new continent. Led by Leif Erikson, a small party landed in a place they called Vinland, likely modern-day Newfoundland. At a site now known as Lanseaux Meadows, they built a small settlement, a handful of turf-walled huts, a forge, a workshop. This was the first European outpost in the Americas. But it was a fragile foothold, thousands of treacherous miles from home. The Norse were few, their resources were limited, and they were not stepping into an empty wilderness. The land was already home to a numerous and well-established native population, whom the Norse called Skraelings. This was not a meeting of a superpower and a primitive tribe. It was a meeting of two Iron Age peoples, both masters of their own environment, on a remote and unforgiving frontier. The Norse settlement in Vinland lasted for perhaps only a decade. The sagas, our primary source, are sparse on details, but they speak of internal strife and, crucially, of conflict with the native peoples. One story tells of a trade negotiation that turned violent over a Norse bull, leading to a battle in which the Vikings were nearly overwhelmed. Ultimately, the colony failed because it was unsustainable. The hostility of the far more numerous native population, combined with the immense difficulty of resupply from Greenland, made the small settlement an impossibility. The hinge of fate is that first, fateful contact. The sagas describe it as a mix of curiosity and immediate hostility. Imagine a different outcome. Imagine that instead of conflict, a lasting peace is forged. Perhaps a Norse leader, wiser and more diplomatic than the sagas suggest, establishes a formal, mutually beneficial trade relationship with a local Mi'kmaq or Beotic tribe, offering iron tools and textiles in exchange for food, local knowledge, and most importantly, security. A single act of diplomacy, a single successful treaty, could have changed everything. In this world, the settlement at Lanceaux Meadows survives its first critical decade. Bolstered by native trade, the Norse are able to build up their food stores and focus on establishing a more permanent colony. More settlers arrive from the overpopulated farms of Iceland and the marginal lands of Greenland. The colony, which they call Vinland, slowly grows. It never becomes a massive, sprawling empire, but rather a distinct and unique Norse American culture. Over the next century, a slow and profound exchange begins. The Norse introduce ironworking to the native peoples of the Northeast. Iron axe heads, knives, and arrowheads begin to spread through ancient trade networks, transforming hunting, warfare, and agriculture for dozens of tribes. The Norse, in turn, adopt native crops like maize and squash, which prove far more suitable for the local climate than their own barley. They learn native survival techniques, and a new, hybrid people, the Vinlanders, emerges, a blend of Norse and Native American bloodlines, cultures, and technologies. By the 1400s, this exchange has reshaped the continent. The Iroquois Confederacy, now armed with iron weapons, becomes an even more formidable power. The knowledge of the Vinland colony filters back to Europe, not as a forgotten myth, but as a known fact. Maps in Iceland and Norway show a large landmass to the west. When Christopher Columbus sails in 1492, he is not an explorer seeking a new route to Asia. He is a navigator attempting to reach the known, semi-legendary land of Vinland. He doesn't find a new world of isolated Stone Age peoples. He finds a coastline inhabited by complex native confederacies who possess iron tools, have a genetic resistance to some European diseases built up through centuries of slow contact, and who know exactly who these strange men from across the sea are. In this world, the European colonization of the Americas is not a swift, brutal conquest, but a much slower, more complex process of negotiation, conflict, and integration with established, technologically advanced native powers. The Columbian Exchange is preempted by a centuries-long Vinlandic Exchange. The history of the Americas is not one of a lost world suddenly discovered, but of two worlds that grew up together, forever altering the genetic, cultural, and political map of the entire planet. The Great Shock of 1492 is replaced by a long, slow, and transformative conversation between continents. What if China's treasure fleet never stopped sailing? In the early 15th century, while European nations were still tentatively hugging the coastlines in their small, fragile ships, the Ming dynasty of China was the undisputed master of the seas. Under the commission of the ambitious Yongle Emperor, the eunuch Admiral Jing He commanded the treasure fleet, the largest and most advanced naval armada the world had ever seen. His flagships, the colossal Baochuan or treasure ships, were over 400 feet long, floating palaces with 9 masts, capable of carrying over 1,000 men. By comparison, Columbus's Santa Maria was a mere 85 feet. Between 1405 and 1433, Jing He led 7 epic expeditions across the Indian Ocean, projecting Chinese power and prestige. He sailed to Vietnam, India, the Persian Gulf, and down the coast of East Africa, bringing back exotic tribute like giraffes and establishing a Chinese-led system of trade and diplomacy. This was not an age of conquest, but of soft power, a demonstration of the unparalleled wealth and technological might of the Middle Kingdom. The age of Chinese naval dominance ended as abruptly as it began. After the death of both the Yongle Emperor and Admiral Jing He, a new political wind blew through the Forbidden City. The powerful Confucian scholar bureaucrats, who had long viewed the expeditions as an expensive and unnecessary extravagance, gained the upper hand at court. They argued that China was a self-sufficient agricultural empire, and that the true threats were the nomads on the northern border, not the distant barbarians across the sea. In 1433, the Xuande emperor, persuaded by these arguments, issued an imperial edict. The voyages were to cease. The great treasure ships were left to rot in their harbors, and the blueprints for their construction were destroyed. This policy, known as the hygiene or sea ban, marked a deliberate turning inward. The hinge of fate was this single, monumental political decision to abandon the oceans, a choice that would cede the next 500 years of global exploration to the small, fractious nations of Europe. But imagine a world where that edict is never issued. Imagine the Yongle Emperor lives another decade, or that his successor sees the immense economic and political benefits of the fleet. The voyages do not stop, they expand. Having mapped the Indian Ocean, the treasure fleet's next logical step is to see what lies beyond the tip of Africa. Decades before Vasco da Gama, Xinghi's fleet rounds the Cape of Good Hope and sails into the Atlantic. They follow the African coast north, establishing trading posts as they go. Sometime in the mid-1450s, the people of Lisbon, Portugal, wake to an unbelievable sight, a fleet of colossal ships, larger than any building in their city, sailing up the Tagus River. This is not an invasion. It is a trade mission. The arrival of the Chinese in Europe is the single most transformative event of the Renaissance. The small, warring European kingdoms are awestruck by the wealth, size, and sophistication of the Ming fleet. China establishes permanent trading embassies in Lisbon, Venice, and London. Chinese goods, far superior to European manufactures, flood the market. But more importantly, it is a transfer of knowledge. Chinese science, medicine, and philosophy trigger a new, even more intense wave of intellectual activity. The European age of discovery is stillborn. Why would Portugal risk sailing around Africa when the Chinese already control those routes? Why would Spain fund a risky westward voyage when the true wealth of the world is arriving in Chinese ships? It is China that continues to explore, eventually sailing east from their American trading posts to complete the first circumnavigation of the globe. The world becomes Sino-centric. The global economy is managed not from London or Amsterdam, but from Nanjing. In this world, the Industrial Revolution happens first in the Yangtze River Delta, not in Manchester. The dominant global culture is not Western, but Chinese. European nations remain regional powers, their development profoundly influenced and perhaps overshadowed by the technological and economic might of the Ming dynasty. The world map is drawn from a Chinese perspective, and the history of the last 500 years is not one of Western ascendancy, but of a stable, global Chinese hegemony. The great question of our time would not be the rise of China, but its long, uninterrupted continuation. The image of Chinese treasure ships docking in London or Lisbon is a powerful one. It presents a world so fundamentally different from our own. We've seen a North America that was never new, and a Europe that never became the center of the world. It makes you wonder about the nature of these alternate paths. Which of the worlds we've visited so far, from Alexander's global empire to a Viking America or a Chinese-led age of discovery, do you think would be the most peaceful? And which do you think would be the most chaotic and filled with conflict? There's no right answer, of course, but it's a fascinating thought experiment about the nature of power and progress. I would love to read your perspective in the comments below. What if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? The year is 1588. The world is a stage for a great ideological and military struggle between Catholic Spain and Protestant England. Spain, under the devout and determined King Philip II, is the world's first global superpower, fueled by the vast silver and gold reserves of the Americas. It commands the most formidable army in Europe, the feared tercios. England, under the pragmatic and resilient Queen Elizabeth I, is a small, defiant island nation. It is a thorn in Philip's side, actively supporting the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the Netherlands and unleashing privateers like Sir Francis Drake to plunder Spanish treasure fleets on the high seas. For Philip, this is not just a matter of politics, but of faith. He sees it as his sacred duty to God to crush this Protestant heresy and bring England back into the fold of the one true Church. To this end, he assembles the largest fleet ever seen in Europe, the Invincible Armada, a massive crescent of 130 ships, tasked with invading England and deposing Elizabeth once and for all. The Armada's plan was complex. It was to sail up the English Channel, defeat the English fleet, and then anchor off the coast of the Spanish Netherlands. There, it would ferry the Duke of Parma's elite army of 30,000 men across the Channel for the invasion of England. The English fleet, though outnumbered, was composed of smaller, faster, and more maneuverable ships with longer-range cannons. After a running battle up the Channel, the English launched a decisive attack at Calais, sending 8 burning fire ships into the anchored Spanish fleet. The Spanish panicked, cut their anchor cables, and their tight formation was broken. But the true hinge of fate was the weather. As the scattered armada was forced into the North Sea, a ferocious, unseasonable storm, what the English called the Protestant wind, blew them north. This hurricane-force gale smashed the fleet against the coasts of Scotland and Ireland as it tried to limp home, destroying dozens of ships and killing thousands of men. But imagine a world with a different forecast. Imagine the winds are calm. The English fire ship attack at Calais causes some confusion, but the disciplined Spanish fleet is able to reform. They establish a secure blockade of the Dutch coast, and over the course of a few days, the Duke of Parma's veteran army is ferried across the narrow strait and lands on the shores of Kent. The English militias, though filled with patriotic fervor, are an amateur force, no match for the hardened Spanish tercios. The Spanish army marches on London. Elizabeth I is captured, perhaps at the Tower of London, and is eventually deposed and executed. England is forcibly returned to the Catholic faith. The Inquisition is established in London to root out the Protestant heresy, and a Spanish puppet monarch is placed on the throne. The consequences ripple across the globe. The Dutch revolt, deprived of its main ally and source of funding, is systematically crushed by Parma's army. Spain's control of the Atlantic and its American empire becomes absolute and unchallenged. There is no British Empire. There are no English colonies in North America, no Jamestown, no Plymouth Rock. The eastern seaboard of what we call the United States is instead colonized by Spain, becoming Nueva España del Norte. The dominant language is Spanish, the religion is Catholic. The great ideological struggles of the next century are not between England and Spain, but between a monolithic Spanish Catholic superpower and its only remaining rival, France. The ideas that would later define the modern West, parliamentary democracy, individual liberty, freedom of religion, which were nurtured in the unique political environment of England, are strangled in the cradle. The world of the 17th and 18th centuries is a world of absolute monarchy and religious orthodoxy, dominated by the golden and red flag of Spain. In this world, the global lingua franca is not English, but Spanish. The dominant cultural and political forces in the Americas are Spanish and Catholic. The rise of parliamentary democracy and the Anglo-American model of capitalism and individual rights never happens. The world is less religiously diverse, more authoritarian, and its center of gravity remains firmly in Madrid, not London or Washington. The defeat of the Armada was the moment England secured its future, and in doing so, shaped ours. Its victory would have created a world that we would find almost unrecognizable. What if the Black Death had never happened? In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was full to bursting. The High Middle Ages had seen a period of warm weather and improved agricultural techniques, leading to a massive population boom. But by 1347, the continent had reached its Malthusian limit. There were too many people for the available land and technology to support. Most of the population consisted of serfs, tied to the land they worked, living in a state of perpetual obligation to a tiny, hereditary nobility. Society was a rigid pyramid, with God at the top, followed by the Pope, kings, lords, and finally, at the very bottom, the vast sea of peasantry. Social mobility was virtually non-existent. The Catholic Church was the supreme spiritual and intellectual authority, its doctrines shaping every aspect of life, from birth to death. It was a world of tradition, obligation, and hierarchy, a society that had been structured in the same way for centuries, and one that was beginning to creak under the strain of its own population. It was a world ripe for a shattering change, but no one could have imagined the form it would take. The hinge of fate was not a person or an idea, but a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. It originated in the arid plains of Central Asia and traveled west along the Silk Road, carried by fleas living on the black rats that infested merchant caravans and ships. The point of entry into Europe was the Genoese trading post of Kaffa in the Crimea. In 1347, a Mongol army besieging the city began to succumb to the disease. In an act of early biological warfare, the Mongols used catapults to hurl the infected corpses of their dead over the city walls. The Genoese traders, terrified, fled in their ships, but it was too late. The rats, the fleas, and the plague were on board with them. When their ships docked in Sicily, and then mainland Italy, the pestilence came ashore. The hinge was the successful transmission of this specific, horrifyingly virulent pathogen into a densely populated, interconnected, and completely unprepared Europe. A single infected rat, scurrying down a mooring rope in the port of Messina, was all it took to unleash the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. But imagine a world where that chain of transmission is broken. Imagine the Mongol siege of Kaffa ends before the plague takes hold, or a simple quarantine in the first Italian port is miraculously successful. The Black Death never arrives in Europe. The continent continues on its previous trajectory. The population continues to grow, putting ever more strain on the food supply. Widespread famines, like the Great Famine of the early 1300s, become more frequent and more severe. The rigid feudal system, already under strain, becomes even more entrenched. With a surplus of labor, serfs have no leverage to demand better wages or freedom. The power of the land-owning nobility remains absolute. Social mobility stagnates completely. The gap between the rich and the desperately poor widens into a chasm, leading to more frequent but ultimately unsuccessful peasant revolts, brutally crushed by the armored aristocracy. Without the profound psychological shock of the plague, a cataclysm that killed indiscriminately, taking priests and princes as easily as peasants, the unquestioned authority of the Church is not so deeply challenged. The obsession with death and the macabre that influenced late medieval art never appears. The Renaissance might still happen, but it would be a different, more aristocratic affair, a pursuit of the wealthy with little impact on the broader society, less infused with the new, humanistic energy that came from social upheaval. Technological innovation slows down. Without a massive labor shortage, there is far less incentive to create labor-saving devices like the printing press. Europe in 1500 would be more populous, but also poorer on a per capita basis. It would be more traditional, more hierarchical, and far less dynamic. The great social and economic shifts that the plague accidentally triggered, the rise of a middle class, the decline of feudalism, the questioning of authority, are delayed by centuries, if they happen at all. The modern world, with its emphasis on individual economic freedom, the rise of capitalism, and the questioning of religious authority, was born from the ashes of the old feudal order. The Black Death, for all its horror, was the fire that cleared the way for that new world to grow. Without it, Europe might have remained locked in a medieval stasis for much longer, potentially being surpassed by other, more dynamic civilizations. Our world was, in a strange and terrible way, fertilized by the graves of a third of Europe's population, a grim reminder that progress can sometimes have an appalling price. What if the Inca Empire had repelled Pizarro? In 1532, the Inca Empire, the Tawantinsuyu, or Realm of the Four Parts, was the largest empire on Earth. It stretched 2,500 miles along the spine of the Andes, from modern-day Colombia to Chile, a domain of breathtaking environmental diversity. It was a marvel of engineering and social organization, with 14,000 miles of roads, sophisticated terrace farming that conquered the mountain slopes, and a complex system of tribute and redistribution managed without currency or a written language, using knotted strings called quipus. However, this mighty empire was deeply vulnerable. It had just emerged from a bloody civil war between two half-brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, a conflict that had fractured its political unity. More devastatingly, it was being ravaged by a silent, invisible enemy, smallpox. The disease, traveling faster than the Europeans themselves, had swept down from Panama, killing millions, including the previous emperor and his heir, which had triggered the civil war in the first place. Into this weakened and divided empire came Francisco Pizarro, with a tiny, desperate force of just 168 men. The turning point was the encounter at Cajamarca. Atahualpa, the victorious new emperor, flushed with his victory over his brother, agreed to meet Pizarro in the town's main square. He arrived with a retinue of thousands of his best warriors, but they were largely unarmed, in a ceremonial procession intended to awe the strange visitors. He vastly underestimated the Spanish, seeing their small number as a bizarre curiosity, not a serious threat. Pizarro, a hardened and ruthless veteran, had set a trap. His men, armed with steel swords, arquebuses, and cavalry, the tanks of their day, were hidden in the buildings surrounding the square. When Atahualpa, in a moment of supreme arrogance, refused to submit to the Spanish king and threw a Bible on the ground, Pizarro gave the signal. The Spanish unleashed a storm of fire and steel, slaughtering the shocked and unarmed Inca retinue and capturing the emperor, the living god-king of the entire empire. The hinge was Atahualpa's fatal miscalculation, his decision to meet a strange new foe in an enclosed space with a ceremonial, rather than a fighting force. But imagine Atahualpa is more cautious. His scouts have reported on the Spaniards' strange weapons and their terrifying great llamas. He has seen the devastation of the plague and knows that the world is filled with new dangers. He refuses to enter the trap at Cajamarca. Instead, he agrees to meet Pizarro in an open field, but he brings his full, veteran army of 80,000 warriors with him, fully armed for battle. The Spanish, seeing they are hopelessly outnumbered and their ambush has failed, are the ones who are intimidated. Perhaps a battle ensues. The Spanish steel and cavalry inflict terrible casualties on the front ranks of the Inca, but they are overwhelmed by sheer numbers, a tide of bronze-tipped spears and maces. Pizarro and his small band are wiped out to the last man. The news of this failed expedition travels back to Panama and Spain. The Inca Empire has proven to be a far harder target than the Aztec. Future expeditions are delayed for decades, and when they arrive, they face an empire that is prepared. Having survived the initial contact, the Inca begin a rapid process of adaptation. They capture Spanish steel weapons, armor, and horses from the fallen conquistadors. Their brilliant metallurgists, already masters of bronze, begin to experiment with iron smelting. The empire, having witnessed the devastating power of the European invaders, begins to centralize and militarize in a new way. The civil war ends, and the state focuses on the external threat. Over the next century, the Inca Empire remains independent. It trades with the Europeans from a position of strength, selectively adopting technologies, firearms, the wheel for transport, perhaps even a written language adapted from Spanish, while retaining its own cultural and religious core. It becomes a major American power, a counterpart to the European empires, controlling the vast mineral wealth of the Andes and shaping its own destiny. In this world, South America's history is not one of conquest and colonization, but of the survival and evolution of a major indigenous empire. The cultural, genetic, and political landscape of the continent is completely different. The Inca Empire, a technologically advancing power, would have been a major player on the world stage in the 17th and 18th centuries. The story of the Americas becomes a story of at least two major, competing power blocks, forever changing the balance of global power and preserving a world of thought and culture that in our timeline was almost completely destroyed. We've traveled a long way in this chapter, from the shores of Vinland to the mountains of Peru. And as we cross what is, for many of you, the quiet threshold of midnight, it feels like a good moment to pause. Time check for our sleepyheads. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling in for the night, with the lights low, or is this a quiet morning meditation for you on the other side of the planet? Let me know in the comments. There is something wonderful in knowing that we are all sharing this journey through these lost worlds together, a quiet community scattered across all the time zones of the night. What if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo? The year is 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had dominated Europe for nearly 2 decades, is back. Having escaped his exile on the island of Elba, he has returned to France and raised an army in a stunning 100-day resurgence. The old monarchies of Europe, who had fought him for years, are terrified. They have declared him an outlaw and assembled the Seventh Coalition, a massive alliance of British, Prussian, Austrian, and Russian armies, to destroy him once and for all. Near the small Belgian village of Waterloo, 2 of these armies stand in his way, a multinational force of British, Dutch, and German troops under the famously stoic Duke of Wellington, and a veteran Prussian army under the grizzled Field Marshal Blücher. Napoleon knows he must strike a decisive blow. He needs to defeat Wellington's army before Blücher's Prussians can arrive to tip the balance. The fate of Europe, and the future of the modern world, hangs on the outcome of a single day's battle in the muddy fields of Belgium. The Battle of Waterloo was a cascade of critical moments. The night before, a torrential downpour had soaked the battlefield, forcing Napoleon to delay his attack for several hours to allow the ground to dry, giving the Prussians precious time to march. But the true hinge of fate lay in the actions of one of Napoleon's marshals, Emmanuel de Grouchy. Napoleon had detached Grouchy with 33,000 men, a third of his army, to pursue the Prussians and prevent them from joining Wellington. As the battle raged at Waterloo, Grouchy heard the thunder of the cannons. His subordinates begged him to march to the sound of the guns, but Grouchy, a man of limited imagination, rigidly stuck to his last orders, to pursue the Prussians. He failed to stop them, and he failed to reinforce Napoleon. The hinge was his decision. Had he marched to Waterloo, his arrival in the afternoon would have shattered Wellington's flank and given Napoleon the overwhelming victory he so desperately needed, long before the first Prussian soldiers appeared on the horizon. But imagine Grouchy makes the fateful decision to march to the sound of the guns. His 33,000 fresh troops arrive on the battlefield in the mid-afternoon, slamming into Wellington's already battered left flank. The Anglo-Allied army, caught between Napoleon's main force and Grouchy's corps, collapses. It is not a defeat, it is an annihilation. The British are driven into the sea. The news of this stunning victory sends shockwaves through the coalition. The Prussians, arriving too late, retreat in disarray. The Austrian and Russian armies, still mobilizing. In Paris, Napoleon's political position is secured. The French people, electrified by the victory, rally to his cause once more. The Seventh Coalition, its unity broken and its will shattered, falls apart. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, knows he cannot conquer all of Europe again. Instead, he uses his victory to negotiate from a position of supreme strength. He forces a new peace treaty, the Peace of Brussels. He retains the throne of France and secures its natural frontiers. Belgium is annexed, and a series of friendly buffer states are established in Germany and Italy. The British, their army destroyed, are forced to accept this new reality. A Cold War settles over Europe, between the continental system of the French Empire and the maritime power of Great Britain. The 19th century becomes the Napoleonic century. The ideals of the French Revolution, metric system, civil rights, and the Napoleonic Code are permanently embedded across the continent. Nationalism, the force that had helped to defeat him in our timeline, is suppressed under a unified, French-dominated imperial system. The unification of Germany and Italy, as we know them, never happens. In this world, the 19th century is not a story of rising British power and competing nationalisms, but of a stable, French-led European superstate. The lingua franca of Europe is French. The political and legal systems of the continent are based on the Napoleonic model. The great wars of the 20th century, born from the bitter rivalries of nations like Germany and France, are averted, replaced by the long, stable, and perhaps stagnant peace of a unified Napoleonic empire. The world is more centralized, more rationalized, and perhaps less free, all because one marshal chose to follow the sound of cannons. What if the American Revolution had failed? In 1776, 13 of Great Britain's North American colonies declared their independence. It was a declaration that was as audacious as it was unlikely to succeed. The colonists were a fractious collection of farmers and merchants with a small, poorly trained, and chronically undersupplied amateur army. They were challenging the greatest military and economic power on the planet. The British Empire commanded the world's most powerful navy, a professional army of seasoned redcoats, and the vast financial resources of a global trading empire. On paper, the conflict was a laughable mismatch. The American cause was plagued by division, with a significant portion of the colonial population remaining loyal to the crown. The Revolution was not just a war against Britain, it was America's first civil war. For the rebellion to succeed, it would require near-perfect leadership, incredible fortitude, and most importantly, a powerful ally to even the odds. The fate of the American experiment rested on a knife's edge, a gamble against overwhelming odds. The Revolution was saved by a single, critical event, the intervention of France. For the first few years of the war, the French secretly supplied the colonists but were hesitant to commit to a full alliance. They were waiting for a sign that the Americans could actually win. That sign came in 1777, with the stunning American victory at the Battle of Saratoga, where an entire British army was forced to surrender. This victory convinced King Louis XVI that the American cause was viable. In 1778, France officially entered the war, followed by Spain and the Netherlands. The hinge of fate was this decision. Without the French alliance, the Revolution almost certainly would have failed. The French fleet challenged British naval supremacy, preventing them from blockading ports and resupplying their armies at will. French gold paid the salaries of the Continental Army, and French troops provided the critical margin of victory at the final, decisive siege of Yorktown. Without France, the American Revolution would have been a doomed provincial uprising. But imagine the American gamble at Saratoga fails. The British Army breaks through and crushes the rebellion in the northern colonies. News of the defeat reaches Paris, and King Louis XVI decides the American cause is a lost one. He withdraws his support. The American Revolution is now completely isolated. The Royal Navy establishes an unbreakable blockade of the entire Atlantic coast. The Continental Army, already suffering at Valley Forge, withers away from starvation, disease, and desertion. George Washington is eventually captured, perhaps in a final, desperate battle. The rebellion is systematically crushed. The leaders of the revolution, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, are transported to London, tried for high treason, and publicly hanged. The 13 colonies are brought back under firm British control, but the relationship is forever changed. They are treated as conquered provinces. The British Parliament imposes harsh new taxes to pay for the war and stations tens of thousands of redcoats permanently in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The dream of self-governance is dead. The British Empire, its authority now unquestioned, becomes even more powerful and centralized. Westward expansion is not a chaotic rush of American pioneers, but a slow, carefully managed process controlled from London. The native tribes are perhaps treated more fairly, protected by the crown from colonial encroachment as a buffer. The institution of slavery, while eventually abolished by the British Parliament in the 1830s, is dismantled through a process of compensated emancipation, not a bloody civil war. The great engine of the 19th century is not a rising United States, but a truly global, unchallenged British superpower, a Britannia unrivaled. In this world, the United States of America never exists. The American experiment, in democracy and individual liberty, is a footnote in history, a failed colonial revolt. The world of the 19th and 20th centuries is dominated by a single, English-speaking superpower, the British Empire. The great ideological struggles of the Cold War, the rise of American culture, none of it happens. The world is more stable, more orderly, and perhaps less free, all because a French king decided a colonial rebellion was a bad investment. We've just imagined a world without the United States, and a Europe united under Napoleon. The great wars that defined the 19th and 20th centuries, the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, the World Wars, shaped our reality in profound and often terrible ways. A world without them is hard to even conceive of. It leads to a difficult question, but a fascinating one. If you could reach back into the past and erase one single conflict from human history, which one would it be, and why? Would you choose the one that cost the most lives? The one that led to the worst consequences? Or one that destroyed a culture you wish had survived? Share your thoughts below. It's a way of thinking about what kind of world we wish we lived in. What if Archduke Franz Ferdinand's driver hadn't made a wrong turn? The summer of 1914. Europe is living through a long peace, a golden age of industrial progress and cultural achievement. But beneath this glittering surface, the continent is a powder keg. A complex and rigid web of military alliances has divided the great powers into two armed camps, the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Great Britain, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Decades of imperial rivalries, a frantic naval arms race between Britain and Germany, and simmering nationalist tensions in the Balkans have created an atmosphere of profound paranoia and mistrust. Each nation has detailed mobilization plans that, once set in motion, would be almost impossible to stop. All that is needed is a single spark to ignite the entire continent. That spark is about to be provided in the obscure Bosnian city of Sarajevo, a provincial outpost of the sprawling, multi-ethnic, and increasingly fragile Austro-Hungarian Empire. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting Sarajevo. A team of Serbian nationalist assassins, armed by a shadowy group known as the Black Hand, is waiting for him. The first assassination attempt fails spectacularly. A bomb is thrown at the Archduke's motorcade, but it bounces off his car and explodes under the vehicle behind it, injuring several officers. The Archduke is unharmed but furious. After a tense reception at the town hall, he insists on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital. Here, the hinge of fate turns on a simple human error. The Archduke's driver is not informed of the change of plans. He follows the original route, turning onto Franz Joseph Street. An official shouts at him that he's gone the wrong way. The driver stops the car and begins to slowly reverse. In that exact moment, one of the conspirators, a young man named Gavrilo Princip, who had been standing dejectedly on that very street corner, looks up and sees the heir to the empire stopped in his car, not 5 feet away. But imagine the driver is told the correct route. He doesn't make the wrong turn. The motorcade continues at speed along the Appel Quay, straight to the hospital. Gavrilo Princip, standing on Franz Joseph Street, never gets his impossible, once-in-a-million chance. The Archduke visits the wounded, his duty done, and his party safely leaves Sarajevo that evening. The assassination has failed. In Vienna, there is outrage over the attempt, but without the martyrs of the royal family, the war party lacks the critical justification for an invasion of Serbia. The July crisis, the series of frantic ultimatums and mobilizations that dragged Europe into war, is averted. The summer of 1914 remains peaceful. The 20th century unfolds along a completely different path. The great powers of Europe, having stared into the abyss, perhaps pull back and engage in a new wave of diplomacy to defuse the tensions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the eventual rule of the reform-minded Emperor Franz Ferdinand, might slowly evolve into a more federalized state, granting greater autonomy to its ethnic minorities and thus surviving for several more decades. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, continues its slow decline, but is not violently dismembered by the war. The Russian Empire, without the catastrophic strain of the Great War, avoids the Bolshevik Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II might be forced to concede to a constitutional monarchy, but the Romanov dynasty survives. The world never knows the horrors of trench warfare, poison gas, or the first industrial-scale slaughter. The great cultural and scientific optimism of the pre-war era continues, leading to a more gradual, less dramatic entry into the modern age. In this world, the entire bloody narrative of the 20th century is erased. No World War I means no punitive Treaty of Versailles, and thus no fertile ground for the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. There is no World War II. There is no Russian Revolution, and therefore no Soviet Union, no Cold War, no nuclear arms race. The history of the last century, so defined by these cataclysmic conflicts, becomes a story of political evolution rather than violent revolution. Billions of lives are saved, all because a driver was given the right directions. What if the South had won the American Civil War? The year is 1863. The United States of America is tearing itself apart. For 2 years, a brutal civil war has raged between the industrial, free labor North and the agrarian, slave-holding South. The conflict is a clash of two fundamentally incompatible civilizations, one built on the ideal of liberty, the other on the economic reality of human bondage. The Confederacy, though outmatched in population and industrial might, has proven incredibly resilient, led by brilliant generals like Robert E. Lee. The Union, despite its advantages, has suffered from a series of humiliating defeats and incompetent leadership. By the summer of 1863, Lee, emboldened by his recent victory at Chancellorsville, decides to take the ultimate gamble. He invades the North for a second time, seeking a decisive victory on Union soil that he hopes will shatter Northern morale, force President Abraham Lincoln to sue for peace, and secure the Confederacy's independence once and for all. He marches his Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania, where the Union's Army of the Potomac moves to intercept him near a small, quiet crossroads town named Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg was the largest and bloodiest battle of the war, a brutal 3-day struggle that became the high-water mark of the Confederacy. The hinge of fate occurred on the third and final day. Having failed to break the Union flanks, Lee staked everything on a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This was Pickett's charge. At around 2 p.m. on July 3, some 12,500 Confederate soldiers began a mile-long march across an open field under a storm of Union cannon and rifle fire. It was a magnificent, heroic, and ultimately suicidal gamble. The Union line bent, but it did not break. The Confederates were repulsed with catastrophic losses, losing more than half their men. Lee was forced to retreat, his army shattered, his invasion a failure. It was a defeat from which the South would never truly recover. But what if that charge, against all odds, had succeeded? What if the Union line had broken? Imagine a slightly different world. Imagine the Confederate artillery barrage preceding the charge is more effective, knocking out more Union cannons. Imagine the Union commander, General Meade, is slower to reinforce his center. The Confederate soldiers, with just a little more support and a little less resistance, punched through the Union line. The center of the Army of the Potomac collapses. Panic spreads, and the Union retreat becomes a disorganized rout. The Battle of Gettysburg is a stunning Confederate victory. Lee's army, though battered, is able to march on Washington, D.C. Panic grips the North. The Copperhead faction, which favors a negotiated peace, gains immense political power. Lincoln, facing a military catastrophe and the potential fall of his own capital, is forced to the negotiating table. In early 1864, he reluctantly signs the Treaty of Philadelphia, officially recognizing the independence of the Confederate States of America. The consequences are profound. North America is now permanently divided into two hostile nations. The United States, shorn of its southern territories, continues as an industrial power, but it is a bitter, humiliated nation, its founding ideals of unity and liberty seemingly failed. The Confederate States of America survives, but it is an international pariah, its economy built entirely on the brutal institution of chattel slavery. Cotton remains king, but the CSA stagnates, failing to industrialize and falling further and further behind the rest of the world. The two nations engage in a long, bitter Cold War. Their shared western frontier becomes a flashpoint, a place of constant skirmishes as they compete for territory and influence. Slavery is not abolished in the South. It continues for decades, becoming an even more entrenched and brutal system of apartheid, a permanent stain on the continent. In this world, the United States never becomes a global superpower. Its moral authority is shattered, its territory is diminished. The great American experiment is a failed state. The continent is defined not by unity, but by a long, ugly history of racial oppression and the constant threat of war between two bitter rivals. The promise of America, a new birth of freedom, dies on a bloody ridge in Pennsylvania, leaving a legacy of division and injustice that would poison the entire world, all because a single infantry charge went the other way. What if the Russian Revolution never happened? The year is 1917. The Russian Empire, after 3 years of catastrophic involvement in World War I, is on the verge of total collapse. The war has bled the nation white, with millions of casualties, widespread food shortages, and a complete breakdown of the transportation system. The authority of Tsar Nicholas II, already weakened by years of autocratic and incompetent rule, has evaporated. In February, a spontaneous popular uprising in the capital, Petrograd, forces him to abdicate, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. A weak, liberal provisional government is established, but it must share power with the radical Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers. Into this chaotic, dual power situation, Germany makes a fateful decision. They find the most radical of the exiled Russian revolutionaries, Vladimir Lenin, and transport him in a sealed train back to Russia, hoping he will further destabilize their enemy and knock Russia out of the war for good. He arrives at the Finland station in April with a clear, ruthless message. Peace, land and bread, and all power to the Soviets. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 was not inevitable. It was a high-stakes coup, a roll of the dice that could have easily failed. By the autumn, the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky was weak, but the Bolsheviks were still a minority party. The hinge of fate was Kerensky's own inaction and Lenin's iron will. In the days leading up to the planned coup, Kerensky was aware of the Bolsheviks' intentions but failed to act decisively. He didn't arrest the leaders, he didn't declare a state of emergency, he didn't rally loyal troops to the capital. He hesitated. Lenin, on the other hand, was relentless, bullying his more cautious comrades into action. Imagine a different scenario. Imagine Kerensky, finally grasping the moral danger he is in, acts with force. He orders a preemptive strike, arresting the entire Bolshevik Central Committee, including Trotsky. He declares martial law and brings reliable army units to Petrograd to secure the city. The Bolshevik coup is decapitated before it can even begin. In this world, the October Revolution is a minor footnote, a failed radical plot. The provisional government, having survived its greatest challenge, is emboldened. It consolidates its power, marginalizing the other radical factions. Russia remains in the war, but its exhausted army is incapable of major offensives. It likely negotiates a separate, less humiliating peace with Germany in 1918. The country avoids the horrors of the Russian Civil War, a conflict that killed over 7 million people and shattered the nation's economy. The Romanov family is not executed. They remain in exile, perhaps in England. The decades that follow are difficult. Russia is a poor, agricultural, and politically unstable nation. It likely cycles through a series of weak democratic governments and military dictatorships, much like many other European nations in the interwar period. It might eventually evolve into a constitutional monarchy. But crucially, it is not the Soviet Union. It is not a one-party state dedicated to the cause of world revolution. The Red Terror, the gulags, the forced collectivization that killed millions, none of it happens. The international communist movement, deprived of its state sponsor, remains a fringe ideological movement. The Cold War, the central geopolitical conflict of the second half of the 20th century, never occurs. There is no Iron Curtain dividing Europe. There is no nuclear arms race between two superpowers. The great proxy wars that defined the era, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, do not happen in the same way, if at all. The political map of the world is completely different. In this world, the history of the 20th century is not a story of a titanic struggle between capitalism and communism. Fascism might still rise, but it would face a different coalition of opponents. The world is spared the terror of nuclear annihilation and the oppression of totalitarian communism. The great ideological conflict that shaped our parents' and grandparents' lives is absent. The world is perhaps more chaotic, with more competing great powers, but it is also a world that has not been defined by the shadow of the Kremlin, all because a weak leader acted decisively for once. We've just walked through some of the heaviest and most painful chapters of modern history, a continent defined by slavery, a world without its great democracies, and the specter of totalitarianism. These are difficult paths to walk, and the echoes they leave can be unsettling. So, before we continue our journey, let's take a moment to ground ourselves in the present, in the quiet reality of our own space. Let's take a breath. I invite you to look around you, right now, and find one simple thing of beauty in the room with you. It could be a plant on your windowsill, the warm glow of a lamp, a sleeping pet, or the comforting shape of your favorite cup of tea. Just one small, quiet thing. Let's share a moment of simple, peaceful appreciation in the comments. It's a way to remind ourselves that even when we study the great and terrible tides of history, there is always a quiet harbor to be found in the present moment. What if Hitler had been accepted into art school? In the first decade of the 20th century, Vienna was the glittering cultural and intellectual capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a city of music, of Freud and Klimt, a vibrant, multicultural metropolis where German, Hungarian, Czech, and Jewish cultures mingled. But beneath this sophisticated surface, it was also a city of deep social tensions and virulent anti-Semitism. Into this complex and volatile world came a young man from the provinces, Adolf Hitler. He was an aspiring, if mediocre, artist, filled with romantic dreams of becoming a great painter. He had moved to Vienna with the singular goal of gaining admission to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. For him, this was not just a career choice. It was the entire focus of his young life, the validation he craved. He was a young man at a crossroads, his future an unwritten page, his mind not yet hardened into the monstrous ideology that would later consume him and the world. He was just another hopeful, dreaming artist, standing before the most important door of his life. In 1907, and again in 1908, Adolf Hitler assembled his portfolio of drawings and presented himself for the entrance exam at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Both times he was rejected. The admissions committee, a panel of respected professors, judged his work to be unsatisfactory. They noted his lack of talent in drawing the human figure, his style more suited to architecture than to fine art. The final rejection in 1908 was a crushing blow, the moment that sent his life spiraling downward into poverty, homelessness, and resentment. The hinge of fate is that quiet, academic decision. It was a judgment made by a handful of professors in a stuffy room, a decision they would have forgotten by the next day. Imagine that one of those professors, perhaps seeing a flicker of potential in Hitler's architectural sketches, had argued on his behalf. Imagine the committee had decided, against their better judgment, to give the young man from Linz a chance, to grant him a probationary admission into the school. In this world, a joyful Adolf Hitler enrolls in the Academy of Fine Arts. His life is transformed. Instead of the desperate, lonely years spent in homeless shelters and men's hostels, absorbing the hateful, anti-Semitic pamphlets that circulated in the city's underbelly, his life is now structured and purposeful. He is immersed in the bohemian world of art school. His days are filled with light-drawing classes, lectures on art history, and arguments over coffee with fellow students. Many of these students, and some of his professors are Jewish, and he forms friendships and professional relationships based on shared artistic passions, not on paranoid theories of race. His political anger, born of failure and resentment, is blunted. It never has the fertile ground of personal humiliation in which to grow. He becomes a mediocre but competent painter of landscapes and buildings. He still serves in the German army during World War I, but he is a different man. He is a soldier with a future to return to, a profession waiting for him. After the war, he does not drift into the angry, violent world of extremist politics in Munich. He returns to Vienna or moves to Berlin to pursue a career, perhaps as a set designer for the opera, or as a commercial artist. The tiny, fringe German Workers' Party is never joined by the mesmerizing, charismatic orator who would transform it into the Nazi Party. The beer hall putsch never happens. Mein Kampf is never written. The Nazi Party remains an insignificant and laughable footnote in the chaotic politics of the Weimar Republic, eventually fading into obscurity. The Great Depression still hits Germany, but the nation's response is purely political and economic, not a descent into totalitarian madness. In this world, the entire history of the mid-20th century is rewritten. Without Hitler, there is no Nazi Party as we know it. There is no World War II in Europe, no Blitz, no invasion of the Soviet Union. Most importantly, there is no Holocaust. The greatest genocide in human history, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, is averted. The world is spared its most devastating conflict, and its most horrific crime, all because a few art professors, on a long-forgotten afternoon, decided to give a young man a chance. What if the Cuban Missile Crisis had escalated? October 1962. The Cold War is at its absolute zenith. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two global superpowers, are locked in an ideological and military struggle that spans the globe. Both sides are armed with thousands of nuclear weapons, aimed at each other's cities, held in a delicate and terrifying balance known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The world lives under the constant, existential shadow of nuclear annihilation. That shadow becomes a terrifying reality when American U-2 spy planes discover that the Soviets are secretly installing medium-range nuclear missile sites in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 days the world holds its breath as President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev engage in the most dangerous political and military standoff in human history. Kennedy establishes a naval quarantine around Cuba, and the two leaders exchange tense, secret communications, each trying to find a way out without appearing weak, all while their armies are on the highest alert. The crisis had many potential flashpoints, but the most dangerous moment came on Saturday, October 27th, known as Black Saturday. Deep in the Atlantic, a Soviet submarine, the B-59, was being harassed by U.S. Navy destroyers. The American ships were dropping small, non-lethal depth charges, a standard signaling practice to force the submarine to surface. But on the B-59, which was cut off from communication with Moscow, the captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed that World War III had already begun. Panicked and exhausted, he ordered the launch of the submarine's T-5 nuclear-tipped torpedo, a weapon with the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The launch required the unanimous consent of 3 senior officers on board. The captain agreed. The political officer agreed. The third man, Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla's chief of staff, refused. He argued with the captain, calmed him down, and convinced him to surface. Arkhipov's single, courageous, "Niet" was the hinge upon which the fate of the world turned. But imagine a world where Vasily Arkhipov, under the same immense pressure, agrees with his captain. The launch key is turned. The T-5 nuclear torpedo is fired, and it detonates in the middle of the American Naval Task Force. The aircraft carrier USS Randolph and its escort ships are instantly vaporized in a flash of light and a mushroom cloud. In the White House, the news is received with shock and horror. The Soviets have used a nuclear weapon. The Rubicon has been crossed. President Kennedy, despite his desire for peace, now has no political or military choice. The protocols are clear. He gives the order to launch a full retaliatory strike against the missile sites in Cuba and a limited, surgical, strike against military targets in the Soviet Union. But there is no such thing as a limited nuclear strike. The Soviet Union's early warning systems detect hundreds of incoming American missiles. Their doctrine calls for an immediate, massive, all-out response. They launch their entire arsenal of ICBMs, aimed at every major city in the United States and Western Europe. The doctrine of MAD becomes a terrible reality. Within the space of a single hour, hundreds of nuclear warheads, each many times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, detonate over Washington, Moscow, New York, London, Paris, and Beijing. Billions of people die in the initial firestorms. Civilization, as we know it, is erased in an afternoon. The world that survives is a nightmare. A nuclear winter envelopes the planet as dust and soot from the burning cities block out the sun, causing global temperatures to plummet and crops to fail worldwide. The handful of survivors face a poisoned, radioactive landscape, a twilight world of starvation, radiation sickness, and a complete collapse of all human society. The human story, which began with the discovery of fire, ends with it. The Earth becomes a silent, radioactive tomb, a monument to the failure of two leaders to step back from the brink, and the failure of one good man on a submarine to say, "No." We have just walked to the very edge of the abyss, to a world that was terrifyingly close to becoming our reality. The story of the Cuban Missile Crisis is a stark reminder of how fragile our world is. But the story of the space race holds a different kind of echo, a hint of a more hopeful path. The idea of a collaborative space mission, of humanity working together to reach for the stars, is a powerful one. It makes you wonder what else we could achieve. What is one area today, in our own world, where you wish humanity would put aside its differences and work together on a single, great project? It could be curing a disease, solving climate change, or exploring the oceans. Let's fill the comments with some positive aspirations, with the kinds of missions that could bring out the best in all of us. What if the space race had become a collaborative mission? In the late 1950s and 1960s, the Cold War was not just a military and ideological struggle. It was a technological one. Space became the ultimate high ground, a new and dramatic arena for competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957 was a profound shock to the American psyche. A technological Pearl Harbor that kicked off the space race in earnest. Every launch, every orbit, every spacewalk was a proxy battle, a demonstration of the supposed superiority of one system over the other. It was a race for national prestige and for potential military advantage. This competition reached its peak in 1961, when President John F. Kennedy, seeking a bold and inspiring goal, committed the United States to the audacious challenge of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. The race to the moon was on, a monumental undertaking driven by the fierce logic of Cold War rivalry. The hinge of fate was a quiet shift in President Kennedy's own thinking. While his public stance was one of intense competition, he privately began to explore the idea of turning the race into a partnership. Having stared into the nuclear abyss during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he saw space cooperation as a potential bridge between the two superpowers. In a landmark speech to the United Nations on September 20, 1963, he made a stunning and public proposal. He asked, "Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure. Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all our countries. The hinge was this public offer, and the assassination of Kennedy just 2 months later, which ended any real possibility of it coming to fruition. But imagine a world where Kennedy is not assassinated in November 1963. He and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, having developed a grudging respect for one another after the crisis, see the joint mission as a powerful way to de-escalate tensions and build a lasting peace. The negotiations are long and difficult, filled with suspicion and technical hurdles, but they succeed. The Apollo and Soyuz programs are merged into a single, unprecedented international effort, the Artemis-Soyuz program. The goal is no longer to beat the other side, but to explore. For all mankind. The immense financial and intellectual resources of both superpowers are pooled. The best American engineers work alongside the brilliant Soviet rocket designers like Sergei Korolev, who in this timeline is publicly acknowledged and celebrated. The mission becomes a powerful symbol of peace and cooperation, capturing the imagination of the entire world. The first landing on the moon, perhaps in the mid-1970s, is an international crew, an American commander like Neil Armstrong, and a Soviet cosmonaut, perhaps the legendary Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space. They step out onto the lunar surface together. They do not plant an American flag, but the flag of the United Nations. Their first words are not just for one nation, but for the entire planet. The impact on global culture and politics is immense. The Cold War is not ended overnight, but its sharpest, most dangerous edges are blunted. The constant, open collaboration in space fosters a generation of trust and scientific exchange. The billions of dollars saved by eliminating redundant programs are directed towards other, even more ambitious joint projects, a permanent, international moon base by the 1980s, and a joint, crewed mission to Mars in the 1990s. In this world, the legacy of the 20th century is not just one of conflict, but of unprecedented cooperation. The Internet, developed in this more collaborative environment, might become a global public utility sooner, designed to connect rather than divide. The very nature of international relations is changed, from a zero-sum game to one of potential partnership. The stars, instead of being a battlefield, become a symbol of what humanity can achieve when it works together, all because a president lived to see his most hopeful and audacious vision for peace realized. What if the Internet remained a closed military/academic network? In the 1980s, the Internet was not a place, it was a tool. Born from the Cold War as ARPANET, a decentralized network designed to survive a nuclear attack, it had evolved into a closed, text-based world used exclusively by the U.S. military, government contractors, and university researchers. It was a small, insular community of experts. There were no websites, no images, no search engines as we know them. Communication was done through clunky email clients and arcane command line interfaces. It was a powerful tool for collaboration among a tiny, select group, but it was utterly inaccessible and largely unknown to the general public. For most people, the digital world consisted of siloed, proprietary services like CompuServe and AOL, which you dialed into with a modem. The idea that these separate networks would one day merge into a single, global, publicly accessible web of information was a distant, almost unimaginable science fiction concept. The Internet was a government project, and for all intents and purposes, it was meant to stay that way. The hinge of fate was not a single event, but a pair of crucial, philosophically driven decisions. The first was the U.S. National Science Foundation's decision in the early 1990s to lift the restriction on commercial activity over the network's backbone. But the truly world-changing moment came from a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee, working at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory in Switzerland. In 1991, he developed a system for organizing information based on hypertext. He created the three foundational technologies that make the web work: the URL, the address for every page, HTTP, the language for fetching pages, and HTML, the language for creating pages. He also created the first web browser and web server. The hinge was what he and CERN did next. They released the entire technology to the world for free. There were no patents, no licensing fees, no royalties. They made a conscious, deliberate choice to make the World Wide Web an open, universal, and free standard for everyone. But imagine a different world, one where CERN, or a private corporation, decides to patent this revolutionary technology. The World Wide Web becomes a proprietary, licensed product. To create a website, you have to pay a hefty fee to the patent holder. To build a browser, you need to license the technology. The explosive, chaotic, and democratic growth of the early web never happens. Instead of a single, universal web, the digital world remains a collection of competing, incompatible, walled gardens, much like the online services of the 1980s. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, and IBM developed their own proprietary hypertext networks. To access information on the Microsoft Net, you need a Microsoft browser and a Microsoft subscription. To see what's on the Apple Web, you need their software. The very concept of a universal search engine like Google is impossible, because there is no universal web to index. E-commerce is a fraction of what it becomes. Instead of a global marketplace, you can only buy from the stores that have paid to be on your specific network. Social media as a global phenomenon never emerges. There is no Facebook connecting billions, no Twitter for global conversations. Instead, you might have a small forum exclusively for subscribers of your particular service. The free and open exchange of information that has defined the last 30 years is stifled. The Arab Spring, organized on social media, doesn't happen. The vast educational resources of Wikipedia, YouTube, and countless university websites are either behind expensive paywalls or don't exist at all. The digital divide becomes a chasm, with access to information being a luxury good, not a public utility. The world is far less connected, innovation is slower, and knowledge is once again hoarded by those who can afford to pay for it. Our entire modern reality is built upon the foundation of that single, generous decision to make the web open and free. The way we learn, shop, protest, fall in love, and consume media is a direct consequence of an open internet. Without it, the global brain we all tap into every day would be a fractured, expensive, and corporate-controlled landscape. The greatest information-sharing tool in human history would have been just another product, and the world we live in today would be almost unrecognizably disconnected and uninformed. We are nearing the end of our long journey through the lost corridors of time. We have seen empires rise and fall on the turn of a single battle. We have seen the world saved by a quiet refusal and remade by a generous gift. We have seen history shaped by the grand ambitions of emperors and the quiet, personal decisions of soldiers, scientists, and artists. As we prepare for our final story, I want to ask you to look back with me. Of all the stories you've heard tonight, which individual's choice, from Alexander the Great to a forgotten art professor, do you think had the most profound and far-reaching impact on history? I'm very curious to see your answers in the comments. It's a way of asking ourselves what history is truly made of. What if Stanislav Petrov had followed protocol? The year is 1983. The Cold War has entered its most dangerous and paranoid phase. Just 3 weeks earlier, Soviet fighters had shot down a Korean civilian airliner, killing all 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. President Ronald Reagan had recently labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire, and was pursuing the aggressive Strategic Defense Initiative. The Soviet leadership, under the ailing and deeply suspicious Yuri Andropov, genuinely believed that the United States was planning a surprise nuclear first strike. On both sides, fingers were hovering over the button. In a secret military bunker called Serpukhov 15, just outside Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov began his shift as the duty officer. His job was to monitor the Soviet Union's Oko nuclear early warning satellite system. His instructions were simple and absolute. If the system detected an incoming missile launch from the United States, he was to report it up the chain of command immediately. This report would be the trigger for a full-scale Soviet retaliatory launch. Shortly after midnight on September 26, the unthinkable happened. A piercing siren wailed through the bunker. A giant screen, in blazing red letters, read, "Start." The system was reporting that a single Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from a base in America and was streaking towards the Soviet Union. Then a second missile appeared. Then a third, a fourth, and a fifth. The system was unequivocally reporting a U.S. first strike. The protocol was clear. Petrov had minutes to make a phone call that would, in all likelihood, end the world. But he hesitated. Something felt wrong. His gut told him that any real American first strike would be a massive, all-out attack, not a paltry 5 missiles. He knew the satellite system was new and had flaws. He was faced with an impossible choice: trust the computer and his orders, or trust his own human intuition. The hinge of fate was his decision, in that moment of supreme terror, to pick up the phone and report a system malfunction, directly disobeying the standing orders that were the bedrock of his country's defense. But imagine Petrov is a different man. He is a man who trusts technology, a man who believes in the chain of command above all else. The siren screams. The screen flashes. Start. He sees 5 missiles confirmed by the system. He does his duty. He picks up the direct line to the high command of the Soviet military and, his voice steady, reports exactly what he sees. "I am reporting a confirmed missile attack from the United States." The report is taken with the utmost gravity. The information is from their brand new, state-of-the-art satellite system. There is no time to wait for ground-based radar confirmation. By then, it would be too late. The Soviet leadership, already primed by paranoia to believe an attack was imminent, sees their worst fears realized. The decision is made in minutes. The order is given to launch a full and immediate retaliatory strike. Across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, silo doors slide open. From the depths of the Arctic Ocean, submarine hatches are thrown back. Thousands of nuclear warheads lift off on pillars of fire, arcing across the globe towards every major city and military installation in North America and Western Europe. In the NORAD command center deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, the screens light up with an unbelievable number of inbound targets. The world holds its breath for the last time. Before the first Soviet warheads impact, the US and its NATO allies launch their own arsenals in response. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction is fulfilled in a final, global act of suicide. The world that Vasily Arkhipov had saved with his "no" in 1962 is utterly and completely annihilated in 1983, all because of sunlight glinting off high-altitude clouds, and a good soldier's decision to simply follow his orders. In our timeline, Stanislav Petrov was not hailed as a hero. He was reprimanded for a minor paperwork error and quietly retired. He died in obscurity in 2017. Yet, it is not an exaggeration to say that everyone you know, and everyone you have ever loved, owes their life to his quiet act of insubordination. His story is the ultimate testament to the fact that history is not just made by kings and generals, but by the moral courage of ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. He saved the world, and in doing so, gave us the gift of a future he would never be thanked for. And so, our journey through the worlds that never were comes to an end. We have stood on the plains of Gaugamela and seen an empire die at birth. We have watched a single wrong turn in Sarajevo plunge a continent into fire, and a quiet refusal in a submarine save a world from burning. We have seen how the grand, sweeping tides of history can turn on the smallest of hinges: a failed art school exam, a marshal who chose to follow orders instead of the sound of cannons, a driver who was given the correct directions. What these stories teach us, more than anything, is that the world we inhabit is not an inevitability. Our present is not a solid, predetermined destination, but just one of countless possible outcomes, a fragile and improbable miracle built upon a foundation of chance, chaos, and choice. For every event that happened, there are 1,000 that did not. For every path taken, an infinity of others were left unexplored. Our reality is haunted by the ghosts of these other worlds, the echoes of what might have been. We can almost hear them in the quiet of the night. The sound of Viking longships on the Hudson, the hum of a unified Napoleonic Europe, the silence of a world without a world war. But the ghosts of these other worlds are not here to frighten us. They are here to remind us that the story is still being written. That our choices, right now, in this moment, are forging the history of tomorrow. The world is not a finished book that we are merely reading. It is a story that we are all writing together, line by line, choice by choice. The past was once as uncertain and as unwritten as our future is now. And that is a profound, and perhaps even hopeful, realization. It places a quiet, but immense, responsibility in our hands. It reminds us that history is not just something that happens to us, but something that we make. We have traveled a very long way tonight, through 2 full hours of empires of the mind and wars that never were. We've crossed oceans of time and continents of possibility together. And for that, I want to extend my deepest and most sincere gratitude. Thank you for sharing this quiet space, for lending me your time and your imagination. This channel, History for Sleepyheads, has always been about more than just reciting facts and dates. It's about finding the human story within the grand narrative, about using the past as a landscape for wonder and contemplation. It's a quiet place to let the noise of the present day fall away and to simply drift through the great stories of our shared human experience. And I am so grateful that you have chosen to be a part of this community. Your presence here, your thoughts and your curiosity, are what bring this library to life. And so, I would love to hear from you. Of all the 20 alternate histories we explored on this journey, which one do you find the most compelling? The one that will linger in your thoughts as you drift off to sleep? Was it the world saved by Stanislav Petrov's quiet courage? The world transformed by a collaborative mission to the moon? Or perhaps a more ancient world, where the Library of Alexandria never burned? And, as we close the book on this chapter, I wonder what stories you think we should explore next. Is there a major what-if, a critical hinge of fate that we didn't cover tonight, that you would love to see explored in a future journey? The library is always open, and your suggestions are a truly valuable addition to its shelves. They help shape the future of this channel, and ensure that we are exploring the histories that matter most to you. If these stories have brought you a moment of peace, a flicker of wonder, or simply a comfortable companion in the quiet hours, I would be so grateful if you would consider leaving a like on the video. It's a small, silent gesture that helps this channel reach other sleepyheads who might be looking for a quiet place to rest their minds. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to join our library of sleepyheads for all our future journeys into the past. Thank you, once again, for being here. It has been an honor to be your guide. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with wonderful stories.